This is a 1984 Mercedes-Benz 500SEC, and it's downright cool. This is a big body Benz with a big V8 under the hood, the S-Class coupe of its day, and it features some period AMG upgrades to give it an awesome 1980s style. This is a cool car, and today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this 500SEC is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a desirable SEC model with a big V8 and those period AMG upgrades, but it also has just under 11,000 miles and it's been with one family since it was a brand new car, and you can get it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this big body Benz, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of this old school 500SEC. So let's start with the basics. The W126, that was Mercedes-Benz internal model designation for this body style of S-Class, and it was the S-Class of the 1980s. It was sold from like 79 to 91, but it was mainly known as being there for the whole 80s. Now, this is the coupe version, technically the C126, and it was also offered for the majority of that time. I think the first couple years it was just the sedan, but the coupe joined soon after. Now, the 126 chassis cars had broad luxury appeal. They offered 7 different gasoline engine options, 3 different diesel engine options, and 3 different available transmissions. But the V8s were always at the top of the heap. That's what everybody wanted. A 5.5-liter V8 was offered late in the 126 model run, the late 1980s. But in the early 80s, the best V8 you could get was the one in this car, the 5-liter M117 V8. It made about 230 horsepower and about 300 pound-feet of torque. That was the top-of-the-line model, and it wasn't sold in the United States. Mercedes-Benz instead sold a smaller V8, a 3.8-liter V8 that made the cars kind of slow. So a lot of people imported these cars privately on the gray market in period. Instead of just dealing with what Mercedes offered, they brought over a car on their own back when it was legal. And that includes this car, which is a Euro market car originally that was brought to the United States in the 80s. Now, this particular car is particularly cool, actually for several reasons, but one is all the AMG upgrades, starting with the body kit. There's a lot of changes to make this car look more stylish, more sporty from AMG that were installed in period before AMG was brought in-house at Mercedes-Benz. So the body kit is the big one. You can see the flared rocker panels on the side made the car look lower and sportier and cooler. Same deal in back. The rear bumper has this sort of lower section that also gives a sportier vibe. And up front, you had kind of a more aggressive front end, again lower, changed the look of the car and gave it a more aggressive stance. This car also has AMG lowering springs, which obviously helped further that lower stance, make it seem sportier and cooler. And probably the most noticeable change is the wheels. The AMG Aero wheels, finished in chrome because of course they were in period, obviously beautifully complements the body kit and really makes this look like an ultimate AMG 80s car. There were other exterior upgrades too. The spoiler is a noticeable one. It's small, probably doesn't really do anything, but it does look cool. And you also had AMG badging in the back, as you can see. Again, this is before the modern day AMG logos and AMG's close and direct work with Mercedes-Benz. This person just wanted their Mercedes to look cool, and so they modified it with AMG. And speaking of badging, the Mercedes-Benz model designations from this period might be a little confusing for some people. 500SEC. So 500 referred to the engine size. Like I said, this has a 5-liter V8. And this car came from an era where a bigger engine meant more power. And so the top-of-the-line models had bigger numbers and the bottom-of-the-line models had lower numbers. It made sense right up until the age of turbocharging and electric cars to number your vehicles this way. Less obvious is the letters SEC. So all of the S-Class models from this period had S-Class, that makes sense. After the S was either E or D. E was for gasoline-powered cars, D was for diesel-powered cars, makes sense. Now, the sedan models would just stop there, 500 SE or 300 SD, or if they were long wheelbase, there was an L at the end, SDL or SEL. But the coupe is a little different. They got a C for coupe, so 500 SEC. It's a little complicated. It was a little hard to figure out. And in 1994, 10 years after this car, Mercedes-Benz changed it. They moved the letters to the front. They got rid of some of the SDL, SEC type model designations. Mostly it was just S. And this car eventually became the CL class. There was the S-Class sedan and the CL was the coupe. Of course, then it later went back to being the S-Class coupe and convertible, which is a little confusing, but perhaps not as confusing as the old school Mercedes-Benz model numbering. Aside from that stuff, the badging, the AMG upgrades, this car only had a few interesting exterior quirks. One is the ridged taillights in back. You can see they're not just flat taillight lenses, they have these like little ridges that stick out. Apparently, this was to keep the taillights free of debris. Mercedes-Benz claimed at the time that they had tested these taillights in wind tunnels and putting the ridges in helped keep dirt and dust off the taillights when the car was being driven at speed. No idea if it actually was true, but that's why they did it. And apparently, lighting cleanliness was important to Mercedes-Benz because this car also has wipers on the headlights, as you can see. This was a feature of some Mercedes, Volvo models from this era, and this car has it headlight wipers in addition to, well, obviously, the windshield wipers. Now, other than that, this car doesn't have that many exterior quirks, which was on purpose. This wasn't intended to be quirky, interesting, weird. This was supposed to be a purposeful, business-like design. It was simple, it was attractive, but it was basic. It wasn't trying to be weird or reach into some controversy. It was a purpose-built 80s Mercedes-Benz for titans of business and industry who wanted a no-excuses luxury car. So Mercedes-Benz made one that was no frills on the outside. Now, that is not true of the interior, which actually had quite a few interesting quirks and features. Maybe not by the standards of its day, but certainly in today's perspective, there's some weird stuff in here. But before we get to that, let's start with the steering wheel. An AMG steering wheel replaced the standard boring Mercedes-Benz one. This was another period AMG modification that intended to make the interior look cooler. It was also thicker than the regular Mercedes wheel to give you better hands on the car for control. I also love the floor mats in here that match the badging on the back. AMG on one side, 500 SEC on the other. Interestingly, the floor mats are actually flipped compared to the trunk badging, but they're still cool and obviously another AMG upgrade. But on to the weird stuff. And I will start with the town and country horn. This is what the horn sounds like in this car. But you see this switch on the center control stack? You flip that, and now this is what the horn sounds like. Mercedes-Benz called this a town and country horn, and basically what it meant was you could have a short little beep when you were in cities where traffic is close together, and if you wanted to honk louder, you could do that. Like in the country where distances are further, you could choose the note, the tone of your horn. Or if you wanted to, you could instead simulate a traffic jam with multiple cars like this. And another interesting quirk in this car is the automated seatbelt deliverers. Because this is a coupe with a long door, so front and rear passengers could get in, it's kind of hard when you get inside to reach all the way back and grab your seatbelt. Thankfully, there is an automated seatbelt delivery system. Once you shut the door, this piece, power operated, gives you your seatbelt, and then you plug the seatbelt into the buckle, and then it automatically retreats back into its home in the body of of the car. That's crazy. I see that on modern day Bentleys and other nice cars. To see it on a 40-year-old car, that's pretty impressive engineering and ideas for the time. And how about this as an interesting quirk? You can see the driver mirror is manually operated with this little lever. You move it up, down, the mirror moves corresponding. It makes sense. Weird that this car doesn't have power mirrors, considering its luxury status, but it has power mirror. In the center console, you can see this little mirror switch controls the passenger side mirror. That one is power operated because it would be hard for the driver to reach over and adjust that mirror. So it's electric, but the one on the driver's side is manual, not power mirrors, but power mirror. And another interesting quirk of this car, there's no B pillar. That's the pillar that's kind of in line with the front seat backs, usually on the side windows. In this car, it doesn't exist. So you can roll down front and rear windows and have a totally open air experience without that pillar kind of getting in the way. That makes the car look better. It brings in more air. It's cool. Not many automakers pull it off, but Mercedes-Benz is kind of famous for its pillarless coupes, including this one. And next up, the sunroof. This car does not have a glass sunroof. Instead, it is metal. It opens with this rather odd switch in the center control stack that's like an arrow going above lines. It's a strange image for the sunroof, but you press that and it does open up, giving you an open air experience in this car. Worth pointing out, although Mercedes did build the sedan and obviously the coupe version of the S-Class, there was never a convertible model of the S-Class. Many were modified after the fact to create an S-Class convertible, but Mercedes-Benz never did it from the factory. You had to make do with just your sunroof. And next up, another interesting quirk in this interior, into the gauge cluster. Obviously your typical gauges, speed, tachometer, the clock is in there, but there's also a fuel economy gauge, as you can see. This sort of swinging dial would increase or decrease, go into the red or into the black, depending on how economically you were driving. In a 1980s car, this is what they did. Instead of a digital display showing your instant fuel economy, they gave you a little gauge. BMW actually did it as well until they could get those digital display readouts figured out. That came a little bit later. And next up, another interesting item with this car, this central dial mounted here in the center console. You can see you can push it forward or backwards, and there's like little speakers on it. That's because it changes the positioning of the stereo sound in the speakers. If you move the dial backwards, the sound is for the back seats. If you move it up front, the sound is in the front seats, and of course middle places it in the middle of the car. A lot of vehicles had this. Usually though, it wasn't independent, separate from the stereo head unit, but that is in fact the case here, which is certainly a little unusual. And next up, another unusual item in this car. There are not two sun visors, but instead there are three. You can see driver and passenger sun visor, of course, but there's also a third central sun visor that opens up above the rear view mirror to cut off any potential sun exposure in that little spot that isn't well served by the sun visors on either side. An interesting third sun visor, a nice luxury touch. Also interesting in this car, mounted on the dashboard directly below the gauge cluster, massive letters says unleaded fuel only. Bigger than I've ever seen on any other car, but it makes sense because a lot of these Mercedes-Benz models in period were diesel powered. And so I guess on the gasoline cars, they really wanted to drive home the point, this is not a diesel. You need to put in unleaded regular gasoline in order to make this car run. And so they break up the beauty of the wood and some of the fine materials in here with this rather ugly label, but it had an important function. And next up, another interesting item inside this car. Coming off of the steering column, you can see the cruise control stalk, and interestingly, everything is labeled in German. That's because, like I mentioned before, this car was privately imported to the US 40 years ago, back when it was a new car, but they didn't sell the 500SEC here. And at the time, it was legal to just go buy a car in Europe and import it to the United States. And in some cases, it was even cheaper than buying one directly from Mercedes-Benz USA. And so there are a few European parts and touches here, and this stalk off the steering column is one of them. Also interesting in this car, the giant door. It's so giant that you can see it has two kind of door handles or door pulls you can use to close the door. I would imagine that's intended to be for front passenger and rear passenger. Front would use the front one, and rear would try to struggle to grab the rear door pull if they wanted to close the door. Certainly an interesting touch. One other interesting thing worth pointing out in the front of this car is just how nicely preserved this car is. It is in absolutely absolutely amazing shape. Part of that is owed to the fact that this car has just under 11,000 miles from new, which is amazing. And it's a one-owner car, so the same basic person kind of took care of it its whole life. It's also because the materials used in these cars just held up so well. They were solid, they were well built, well designed, intended for long periods of use, and they were really strong, good materials. Combine those two things together and you'll have a really nicely preserved interior, which indeed is exactly what you have here. But next we move on to the back seat, which has some rather interesting quirks of its own. Now, accessing the back seat is interesting. There's a little kind of rubber button on the side of the front seat. You push it and that releases the front seat back, and then you move the front seat forward. There's no lever like most other cars in this era. The rubber button is kind of an interesting touch, but that gives you access to the back seat, which is actually fairly large, as you might expect for a full-size vehicle based on the S-Class sedan. Decent sized back seat, and you have some cool stuff. For one, you got climate vents back here, which is a surprise. You didn't often see that in cars from this era, especially two-door cars, but this one has it. You also have a cigarette lighter back here and an ashtray, which was very common, especially in European cars from this era. Everybody wanted to smoke, even when sitting in back. It was essential. Other interesting items, there's an armrest that comes out between the two rear seats. You can put that down and add to the rear seat passenger comfort. And the rear window switches, they're back here. So not just the front passengers control the windows, but in back on this little grab handle is the window switch, so rear passengers can roll up or down their windows as well, which isn't always the case in coupes. Sometimes that activity is confined to the front. The other interesting thing back here is what's going on the rear shelf, where there are two panels that can open. One you open up and it's a first aid kit. This is where it lives, this is its home, and it's always there in case you need it. On the other panel that can open, it's just some added storage. If you need a place to put some stuff, you don't really know where it goes, that little panel on the driver's side rear shelf, open it up, and you have some extra hidden storage back there, which actually is kind of a cool spot. Then next up we move on to the trunk, the cargo area in the big old Benz. Open it up and you can see massive trunk back here. No surprise, this is a full-size car. People wanted big storage areas back in the day, and this car delivers. Although getting stuff into the trunk is actually kind of hard. You got to go above this shelf, which stays in place with the license plate and the taillights on it, and so it's a pretty big lift for a heavier item to get into the trunk. But once you're there, you're rewarded by huge, giant cavernous space and extra space on the sides. Next to the wheel wells, there's sort of lower trunk space where you can put other items back here if you want. One other interesting item you'll notice back here on the inside of the trunk lid, you have a warning triangle, which is interesting. You don't often see that on cars here in the States, but it is mandated or has been in various countries in Europe, especially back in the day. And so this car included the warning triangle with it, and nobody ever took it out. Another sign that it was originally sold new in Europe before being privately imported to the States. And finally, our last interesting item under the hood, the engine itself. Actually, getting under the hood in this car is kind of interesting. There's a latch in the driver's footwell, like there almost always is. You pull that and it pops the hood, but there's no single latch up front that you just have to release to open it up. Instead, there are two latches on either side of the grille. You got to push both of them at the same time, and only then does the hood release. So it's basically a two-handed job to get under the hood. I guess Mercedes-Benz really wanted to protect what's under there, or make sure it wouldn't fly open when you're driving fast. Now, when you get under the hood, you can see the big old 5-liter V8. Nothing particularly surprising under here, especially for an 80s car. Of course, no plastic engine cover. A lot of stuff is exposed. That all makes sense. One thing I really like under here is the plaque at the very front that gives all the internal designations. You can see 126044. That's the code for a 126 chassis car with this powertrain, and all the other codes have various meanings. Some of them are the options this vehicle has, and I'm sure some of the other stuff on there has obviously meaning to the factory workers when the car is coming down the line. But it's cool to see that plaque preserved on this car. Another nice example of preservation. As is, by the way, the foam under the hood. It's amazing to me to see the foam in such nice shape. So many cars, it gets so hot under the hood for so many miles that this stuff burns off and starts to get flaky and feathery, and it looks terrible. Here it's preserved because this car just has so few miles. It's really amazing to see that. And it'll be amazing to get it out on the road and see how this drives, especially in its well-preserved state. So let's do it. All right, driving the 500 SEC. This car has this reputation for just utter solidity and peerless build quality at the time, and just a few minutes driving this car, I can tell you that is exactly the situation inside the SEC. It helps that this car has only 11,000 miles. It hasn't really been used heavily, but I've been in ones with 211,000 miles that still look like this. The materials just wear very little. They are well put together, well chosen for longevity and solidity and just operation. And that was what Mercedes was known for in this era. And in fact, back in this era, you know, today, if you have a luxury car, that means your car is full of cutting edge technology. In the 80s, if you had a luxury car, it meant build quality. That's what you were going after. And that's how this car feels. 40 years later, it still feels wonderfully tight and well screwed together, and it is quite impressive to sit in this car and just feel that solidity that Mercedes-Benz was so known for. One interesting thing to talk about with regards to the powertrain, even though this car had the 5-liter V8, which was of course the top powertrain in the 84, like I mentioned, it's not especially fast. That 5-liter V8, and paired to this transmission, they weren't really tuned for performance. Even though this is a coupe, even though this is an S-Class, the S-Class has become more athletic as the years went on. But back in the day, this was supposed to be sort of I would call it like a stylish cruiser. It was a luxury car. The upshifts were intended to be slow and smooth. The powertrain had good torque, but it was not intended to be hustled at high RPMs. It was for sort of smooth, slow, you know, cruising at good speeds. You could drive this on the Autobahn in Germany 100 miles an hour for 30 minutes, but you didn't necessarily want to race stoplight to stoplight. That wasn't the purpose of this car, even though it's a coupe, even though it's the top line powertrain. And indeed, I'm flooring it. There's power here. It can keep up with any traffic, it can accelerate, etc., but it's not fast. It's smooth, it's solid. The shifts are slow. 4-speed automatic that was programmed to make these slow shifts, but they're smooth. That's what this car was for. Athleticism was not its strong suit, and that comes across instantly when you get behind the wheel and drive it. And that's also true when you start trying to, you know, turn. The steering is heavily over-assisted. You know, the goal was like a nice, easy driving experience. It feels planted when you're going straight and getting up speed, but the steering is over-assisted. There's body roll to the car, body lean. This was not intended to be an athletic car. You know, one time I asked Kenan to run somewhere, and he looked at me and he said, "I don't run, I hasten." And that's this car. Like, it doesn't run. It can be fast, it can hasten, but it will never do the like high performance peaky engine thing. I don't hear much going on outside. I really don't hear much going on outside. This car really manages to block out basically all the noise happening around us, which is pretty impressive considering that it's 40 years old. That's not something that you often experience. I can imagine going high speeds on the Autobahn, just going stable, smooth. Gotta install some car phone in the middle, you know, take a call, you're an important business person in Germany. I can also understand driving this car why people imported so many of these on the gray market in the 80s from Europe. In the US, Mercedes, the best engine Mercedes offered at this period was the 380 SDL, 3.8-liter V8, smaller engine, less power. This car is not fast. I can imagine that one must have been really a dog, and so it really made sense to import these cars from Europe, which a lot of people did. Overall, this is an impressive car. It's just nice. It's high quality, it's built well, it feels good, it feels solid, it's just plain nice. And I really enjoy driving it. I enjoy the driving experience. Just so long as you go into it realizing you're not getting a sports car out of this, you're getting a stylish, cool cruiser. And the AMG, all the AMG enhancements only improve on that cool look. Driving around already, people have said to several random strangers have been like, that thing is clean, or that thing is cool. And I think the AMG stuff helps that. It's not fast, but it's cool. It's aging wonderfully, and especially the SEC models, the coupes, I think are aging great. I just love this car for what it is. Not high performance, not crazy, but just a great stylish cruiser that's reliable, well built, solid, with a great V8 under the hood. And so that's the 1984 Mercedes-Benz 500 SEC. This was one of the coolest cars of its era, especially considering the cool AMG upgrades to this one. But the big body design, the V8, the smoothness, this is how ballers roll gold in the 1980s. And you can get this SEC on Cars and Bids if you want to relive those glory days. Anyway, now it's time to give this car a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 47 out of 100, which puts the 500 SEC here against these mostly similar cars. I love the Mercedes-Benz 126 chassis coupes, and I think they're radically undervalued and they ooze old-school cool, especially with this car's AMG treatment. It may not be as sporty as a BMW 850 CSI, but it gets similar attention, and the relaxed luxury drive is a nice vibe too. The build quality in these cars is also excellent, and it's one of the most exceptionally well-made 1980s cars, which is easily proven by this shockingly nice example.